Well, firstly, thank you very much indeed for the invitation. Thank you to you, Charles, and for your extremely generous welcome. Thank you to the Vice-Chancellor, not only for his welcome, but for actually being here, which is good of you, and I appreciate it. And there are a number of people in the audience, some of whom have both been supportive and done battle with me, like Baroness Patricia Hollis, who's here this evening, and who understand the topic very well, so I'm likely to get corrected afterwards if I get anything wrong. I ought to explain, not so much for the audience, but for those who may pick this up on the webcam, that the bruising around my eyes has nothing to do with Charles Clarke having knocked me about a bit, because I once did describe Charles as a bruiser, but because I had a small operation that involved 32 stitches around my eyes, and I hit a door as well, so I have one or two bruises at the moment, but not as many bruises as the people out there that I'm talking about this evening. I want to just pose the question to begin with about why welfare, and I'll distinguish what I mean by welfare in a moment, why welfare is a matter of power politics and not just of morality. The issue of where power lies and who it's used on behalf of and by whom is crucial to the presentation that I'm making tonight. And I put it as crudely as this: who votes in elections? Well, older people do in very large numbers, about twice the percentage turnout of the under 30s for the over 65s, and it's reflected in policy and in decision making. Who doesn't vote? Well, on the whole, the very poor, the disengaged, the alienated, the disadvantaged, and what do they rely on for day-to-day survival? The welfare state. So it's self-evidently a matter that relates to wider political decision making, but also to power politics and to our economy. Why in 1906 and why on a number of occasions in the education field, why did breakfasts start in schools? Why was it decided back in the 1870s that perhaps there would have to be some compulsory education? Because the economy was changing and they needed the particular skills that required at least a basic grasp of education. Nice to mention education today because I was in the House this morning for Michael Gove's capitulation over GCSEs, amongst other things. So you take pleasure where you can these days in politics. So, you know, I just want you to bear in mind who votes and who's alienated and who's outside the system and who doesn't understand that politics really does matter, even when we're disillusioned and things don't go right. I want to reflect back that the debates that we're having at the moment have heritage, given that the Vice-Chancellor is a historian. Again, I have to be careful, but from Speenham land through to the workhouses, from the goose and burial clubs that E.P. Thompson wrote about in the making of the English working class in the 19th century, to the struggle to provide mutuality and reciprocity in terms of the craft unions, through to the debates about earned entitlement, from the development of local welfare and embryo social security systems to their nationalisation, from the beginnings of the pension system before the First World War through to the Beveridge settlement, and 1929-31 recession, the cuts in wages and cuts in benefits, to the cuts in wages and cuts in benefits of 2013, from contributory to, and the debate about contributory entitlements, to the tax credits of the last decade, and from the soup kitchens of the past to the food banks of today. All of these things have a resonance because we've seen the debates happening. We've seen those who are in greatest need as sometimes victims, sometimes the benevolence of paternalism, but very rarely having the political clout to sustain a debate about where they're at and what they need, as opposed to what we feel has to be delivered in a civilized society or for the needs of our economy. So I just want to touch on some of these issues. What links Speenhamland and the workhouse? Well, there was at least a sense of feeling of duty, harsh as it was, that existed towards those who were seen as either feckless or desperately disadvantaged and needed looking after in some form or another. It was tended to bring out the worst in people in terms of what they thought needed to be done to those who were both the victims of circumstance and therefore the victims of well-meaning harshness. And we see it today in the debate about the deserving as opposed to the undeserving. We see it today in some of the contradictions that I hope to touch on in the next 20 minutes that exist in policy, where people start out with the best intentions and end up with absolute disasters. I mentioned the goose and burial clubs because the development of embryo systems of mutuality and reciprocity have quite a lot to teach us. People who saved for Christmas in the clubs that were often set up by the early trade union movement or by people in their immediate neighbourhood also saved for dignity in burial. And it's interesting that Christmas and burial came to be seen together. The nearest I get to that is over drinking and eating, but it was about the good and the disastrous in life. And of course, alongside it went the mutuality and reciprocity of people helping each other to survive on a daily basis in terms of giving of their time, giving of whatever goods and provisions they had, often against all the odds, and people literally looking after each other. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because I do want to distinguish. Tonight I'm talking very much about benefits and welfare and income, whereas I know that there is a social wage. I am long enough in the tooth to have remembered Barbara Castle's lectures and strictures, as well as having read her autobiographies. And I'm aware that some of the things that I was involved in and Charles was involved in are as important to the future of the welfare state as the benefits system themselves. The issue of Sure Start, for instance, which is now unring fenced and is disappearing rapidly, is as much about building people from the very earliest years of their life out of poverty and intergenerational disadvantage, as is anything that we do through the income-related system. So just let me always keep remembering that there is an issue out there that we have to get hold of. The issue that I think underpins, again, this coming together of the social wage and the benefits and welfare system that was recognised, 50 years ago, when it was rightly pointed out that anything that was solely for the poor would be very poor. Any service that was solely for the poor would be a poor service. So we've tried to square the circle of having a welfare state that is available to the many and is paid for by the many and therefore is valued by the many. But in doing so, of course, we've run into the perennial problems of those better off, those well-informed, actually taking greater advantage of the wider welfare state and of the provision of services than those in most need of them. And we have, today we have this debate. Let me just give you one example. The example would be the issue of tax relief on pension contributions. They modified it a little bit. There's 1.2 billion when it fully comes in taken out of the handout that we give to people on higher rate tax in terms of relief, but it compares with the 5.8 billion that was taken when it fully is implemented from the very poor at the very moment that it's announced. So we see a 5-to-1 ratio. The interesting technical questions about the issues around child benefit. I've got some solutions to these things, but I just want you to think about, till I get to them, why it is that we don't think we can have universal benefits and then tax them. Just let's mull that over for a minute or two. But the complexity of our system has grown up because we've tried to square fairness with universality. We've tried to concentrate on helping those in greatest need whilst keeping on board those who did not need what we were offering. And I would suggest that tonight when we go away, we think about these issues, because just coming here today has given me the opportunity to think a little about some of the things that we were involved in. So you can have fairness and complexity, you can have crudeness and unfairness. Getting the circle squared is much more difficult. And the good intentions and unforeseen consequences are with us all the time. The sod's law of being in government. Tax credits is a good example. Making work pay is just logical. In fact, I tried to do it with my own sons. My oldest son, when he was at college, before we had education maintenance allowances, now done away with, of course, he said he wasn't going to work at Morrison's filling shelves for the miserable pittance that they were offering. And I said I wasn't prepared to pay him for doing nothing. So we reached an agreement, which was he would work for this pittance and I would top it up. So I paid him an extra £1 an hour, and he thought that was worthwhile, and I thought that it was providing a good incentive to work. Gordon Brown built it into a very substantive tax credit system. Robert Reich, who was the Labour Secretary when I was Education and Employment Secretary, said to me one evening, very wisely, the problem with tax credits is that the government never get the credit. And of course they don't. The problem with tax credits is that it achieves the goal of incentivizing people to want to be in work, but it also incentivizes many employers not to pay a decent wage. Even with the introduction of the minimum wage and the campaign for the living wage, which is absolutely crucial, you're still in a position where you are, of course, subsidizing people on low earnings. And how do you get round this circle, particularly when you've actually got the system working? Child poverty is another example of the sod's law. It's fairly obvious that if you want to overcome grinding child poverty, and you want to do so quickly, then improving some benefits very substantially will help. But of course they then have perverse outcomes in terms of the trap and the difficulty. Child benefit, because it's been universal until this coming year, has been a good example of a benefits provision that could actually reach the parts. The problem was, of course, which is why the present government have chosen to introduce this convoluted system, that it also benefited substantially the better off. Back to my question, why don't we simply tax it? Another contradiction. We have individual taxation, so Patricia Hollis might be able to help me later to work out how we put the system together where the mother gets the child benefit, individual taxation isn't done away with, but we do acknowledge the income of the family, as we do for the tax credit system more generally. How do we square that circle? How do we ensure that we also take account of the perverse incentives that housing benefit brings? I'm not going to give you a lecture on housing benefit, but for the brief time I had responsibility for it, I discovered it was a nightmare. Back in the 1960s, just before I was elected to Sheffield City Council, there was the most enormous row about what was then called rent rebate. And the man who led the revolt against introducing rent rebate, it was a maximum of £0.50 in those days for the oldies amongst you, became my predecessor as leader of the city. And the debate was about the fact that rents should be affordable rather than that rebates should be provided because the rents were unaffordable for a very large swathe of the population. We now have, of course, a rent rebate system, which even for those of us who consider ourselves to be radical on welfare, is completely out of hand. But the present government's proposals to put it right end up not only with absolutely crippling increases in outgoings for those on low and middle incomes, but the absurdity of a situation which pushes people out of social local authority housing into the rented sector, where the housing allowance would probably be bigger than the rent that they were paying in social housing. So we could well end up with the public purse paying more out rather than less, people having to pay more or having to move in circumstances where they can't afford to pay more and they can't find anywhere to move to. So we end up with an attempt to try and do something about a system that's out of hand, that subsidizes historic increases in rent in circumstances where all of us know that we've got to find a radical solution. I haven't got one, by the way, to how we would do this, because it's not where you'd like to be, it's how you get to where you'd like to be that poses the problem. And a bedroom tax, as we've come to call it, is not the way to do it. And I think in the heart of hearts, the government know that. Couple it with a whole range of other changes, and the political and the technical start to be enmeshed in a frightening way. We considered universal credit back in 2005. We laid out principles for welfare reform in September of that year, and I'm sorry to mention you again, but Patricia Hollis worked very closely with me at the time on trying to devise a system that would not penalise women who'd been undertaking caring duties, either childcare or older relatives, and that we would reward making a wider contribution to life than was just possible through paying national insurance. But we were also struggling with, could we have a simpler, more understandable system? Technically at the time, we decided we couldn't do it. Technically, I think it's probably still not doable. And I think they're going to be in real difficulties. But if you were going to do it, you wouldn't have introduced the housing benefit changes, and you certainly wouldn't have introduced changes to council tax benefit at the same time, because there will be some people who will lose £25 on 2 bedrooms and anywhere between £2 and £5 a week on council tax benefit, all at the same time, out of what any of us would consider to be a meagre income. So it's a mess, basically. The system has been and has grown as a mess, and the changes that are being brought about at the moment make it an even bigger mess. So let me take a step back and say, what could we agree on? Could we agree that any system has to have built into it some feeling of reciprocity and mutuality? That people need to feel that if money is being taken from their earnings to assist and support others, and at times of need themselves, there has to be some consent in the system. The early embryo social security system did that because it was close to people. People could see what they contributed into those clubs and what they got back. Incidentally, 10% of the population in the 1850s and 1860s belonged to some form of mutual society, which is worth just thinking about. It was an incredible piece of self-help in those circumstances. There was earned entitlement, i.e. that you put something in and you knew you would be drawing it out. It was a basic insurance system. And there was often conditionality, sometimes crude in terms of peer group pressure, but there was conditionality. And I would suggest that the nearer you can get to earned entitlement, and the more you can have light touch, agreed conditionality, the more people will warm to the idea that they are contributing to a system that is both fair and available to all at a time of need. So, you know, if we can hold on to that for a moment, how do we move towards it? Well, we tried a decade ago to put the employment system and the benefit system together, not just through the broader tax credit system, but through creating Job Centre Plus, so that actually the two were brought together. I was responsible for kickstarting that, and believing that if we had a seamless system which actually linked the idea of assisting people whilst they got back into work and assisting them when they were back in work to stay in work, we might have a system that was less perverse and didn't have the crippling absurdity of taking so much from people's earnings that it wasn't worth actually getting a pay increase, and for some people it wasn't worth going to work. So we tried. We introduced that tax credit system for the reasons I've indicated, but it sort of got out of hand, so it became a fetish. I mean, if you remember watching the leaders' debates in 2010, all Gordon could ever go on about on the one that was on domestic policy was tax credits. Mind you, he was right in saying that they were going to take them away from a very large swathe of the population, but being right actually doesn't help in politics. It's actually winning people over that makes the difference. We didn't get across the fact that the vast majority of the benefits transfer actually helps people in retirement. Next year, the total outlay from the Department for Work and Pensions and the Exchequer will be around £210 billion. 110 billion of it, just over half, will be for people in retirement. 42 billion of the 210 billion will come from the Treasury in forms of tax credit. A very small amount will actually be the job seekers allowance, and that has fallen from 15.6% of average earnings 25 years ago to 11% today. So the notion that there's a vast reservoir of people out there who are draining the welfare state by their sheer idleness in the working age population just isn't true. Now, the problem is that the ones who can be used as examples of feckless and idle make it very difficult for others. I'll just give you an example. In my advice surgery 2 weeks ago, I had a woman who's living very close to her ex-husband. He's got very severe mental health problems. It became impossible for her to live with him, but she couldn't live without him. So she supports him as a carer. She's brought their children up. She's still there for him, but she has 2 empty bedrooms, and it looks as if she's going to have to move. I'm doing my best to see if we can eke out this little amount that's been allocated to local authorities with the devolvement of the social fund to see if we can help her. But 2 weeks before that, at my surgery, 2 men came in to see me to demand why it was that their benefits had been withdrawn because they wouldn't cooperate with the work programme. And I had a chat with them, and they explained to me that they thought they had a right to benefits. And I said, I thought they had a right to benefits if they were prepared to do something for themselves. And I said, have you come to argue that you don't like the work programme? They said, no, they hadn't come to argue that they didn't like the work programme, they just didn't like being made to turn up. And I had to explain to them that life wasn't like that. I had once written an article for the Sunday Times where I did actually explain in the article that I didn't believe that the welfare state was like an ATM machine where you press buttons and you've got somebody else's money out. And so I did try to explain this. What I'd like to say tonight is that those two individuals make the woman's position that I've also explained impossible, because she gets caught up in the way in which those individuals can be used as examples in whipping up fear about the welfare state and turning individuals on each other, often the moderately badly off against the very badly off. And it's been a political trick that's been played over the generations. One other thought. Sometimes we get diverted from understanding the real fundamentals about how we dig people out of dependence and give them independence. I'm obsessed with the issue of assets, of the big divide that exists in our country and is growing all the time between those who have some form of capital asset and those who have none. And I think it is part of the challenge of the welfare state. If you have relatives in London and the South East and they die, grandparents, uncles and aunts, and they leave you their house, that's like winning the lottery. It's an enormous, massive boost. If you live on a council estate and your grandparents die and they leave you their crockery, you're no better off. And the divide that's happening at the moment in our country between those on moderate incomes, not the very wealthy who set up trusts and pretend that they're charitable, and it's happening all the time, by the way, and they run big houses and pay themselves from the trust for flying in their helicopters. It's the other side of it's called the rich welfare state, and we give them tax relief on the charities. But the moderately well off, some with assets and some without, are finding this divide happening to them all the time. The second aspect, alongside building assets, which the Child Trust Fund was intended to do, is the issue of what we do to keep people in work rather than just how we get people into work or out of work. Carol Black produced a report some time ago, and there was a white paper produced with very little fanfare of trumpets about fitness to work about 10 days ago, which has a lot to offer. It's about how you keep people in work, how the economy could save billions of pounds and employers could maintain continuity of employment and not lose trained staff if we just actually had a universal occupational health programme that really worked across the country. It works in patches where GPs and employers are prepared to work together. And I think that even with the nightmare of the commissioning groups, we could return to that. And of course, the other bit, the way in which we help people to help themselves, the hand up. Disabled people suddenly have found themselves demonised unless they're very good at sport, in which case they're heroes. And I have to say that Tony Gray Thompson and others have done a really good job at bringing pressure to bear in stopping the switch from disability living allowance to personal independence payments becoming a complete fiasco. I'm still worried about it, but the guidance that's been issued is a lot better than originally thought. But it still has this perverse incentive built into it. And I've tried to explain this personally to Ian Duncan Smith. If a benefit isn't about income but about facilitation, it's about helping people to live more equally, to be able to buy in things that other people take for granted and can do for themselves. And if you test them on whether they can achieve a task with help, and you judge that they can, but in judging that they can achieve the task, you then take away the help that help them achieve it, are you with me? Then they can't do it anymore, and then they become entitled to the help that you've taken away. My example is a good one. I don't claim disability living allowance, but I get additional support and have done for the last 25 years in the House of Commons. 25, not 26, because it took me a year with a cross-party Commons and Lords working party to make a judgment on what I thought I needed was fair or not. This was really like the capability assessment writ large. ATOS and the other companies would have been proud of the process. It was chaired by Lord Patrick Jenkins, who I'd had the most enormous rows with over the previous years, so it's a wonder I got anything. And they came up with a scheme, and believe it or not, Charles will wince at this, they voted on my package of additional measures on the floor of the House. I mean, how embarrassing can you get? That doesn't happen anymore, thank goodness, even with the Independent Parliamentary Standards Authority. But it was an embarrassment. And the extra help is for people to read and operate the computerized program for Braille transcription. Now, I couldn't do my job on equal terms. I would be an inadequate Member of Parliament. I would be receiving benevolence from others who say, well, he can't really manage it as well as we can, if I didn't have the extra help. But of course, the extra help means making an assessment that fund has to be available. So I just pose it that we're in another contradiction where we're giving people hurdles to jump, and if they go for the hurdles, they might find themselves disadvantaged. Now, we need a different system. What do? Work is the best form of welfare. It always has been and it always will be. So we should always be aiming to give people the wherewithal to be able to work. We need to give them the social, the educational, the training skills, but we need to give them the support. And we need to do so in a rational and organised way. There is a programme that the government have initiated that I actually do agree with. It's called the Troubled Families Programme. It doesn't matter what you call it. They put 458 million into it. And the idea is that you unify the approach to the family as well as the individual to try and pull together the streams that make up sometimes the support, sometimes the disabling programs that make people dependent. And you link that to a program that will get people who can work into work and give them a sense of their own worth and self-esteem. I think it's a really good program, and we should adopt it and enhance it and sophisticate it, and we should give people at local level, the local authority, much greater power to be able to reuse benefits even under a universal benefits scheme. We should unify where we can the tax and benefit system so that we maintain wherever we can universal benefits, but we should tax them. So we should tax child benefit rather than have a convoluted cut-off scheme. We should tax the winter fuel allowance rather than taking it away. We could quite easily make an assumption to tax the free television license, which is a little bit of benevolence from the past, but try taking it away with the over 75s who vote in very large numbers. I'm not sure what you do in relation to the travel scheme. I think we might have to leave that alone for the survival of any party that was going to take it away. We could raise money which then went back into the scheme. For instance, why at the age of 65, when you're carrying on working or you're well off, should you stop paying national insurance? You could raise billions of pounds by thinking about how you could better organise the system. You could raise 6 billion, well actually 5 now when they've taken away the 1.2 billion. You could raise another 5 billion pounds by taking away that pension tax relief for higher rate taxpayers. You could strengthen earned entitlement. Just one small example, which the far right have just hit on, which is that we actually, this is not good for the debate on immigration, on which Charles and I had to struggle when we were in government. But why pay child benefit to children who are not in our country? I don't mind if they're here, but it's an absurd system to be paying, and I did argue with the Treasury on this and they didn't want to know. It's not large sums of money, but sometimes small things actually are irritants in the system and allow other people to be very mean about small amounts of money. So if you can sort them out, you can avoid the system falling apart. And as David Miliband pointed out in the welfare debate a few weeks ago, you could take the whole envelope of the whole tax relief system, the benefit system, the tax credit system, and roll them into one, and then start from scratch and actually take a look at what benefits people are receiving, so that the very well off don't actually get, from the welfare state in its widest sense, the benefit, and nobody gets the credit. So what do we do to help those who are really badly off? Well, of course we have to maintain decent benefits. Of course we should enhance the Troubled Families Scheme. Of course we should have something better than the work programme, which is, I think, on the edge of collapse. I think the model is on the edge of collapse. But we should have earned entitlement, and we should have conditionality, and we should link it to affordable credit, because 2.5 million people at any one period in time are paying the most enormous APR rates for living hand to mouth and borrowing in order to pay back what they've already borrowed. And we should link that to microcredit. We always talk about it for Mexico or South Asia, but microcredit could help people in small ways to start being able to earn in their community, and therefore to start to be able to look to the future, to put a small amount of savings aside. We could reintroduce the savings gateway where government matches it. We could have lifelong accounts where we could build on the concept of the Child Trust Fund, and we could build over a lifetime with reciprocity funds that people could draw down on themselves freely at a time when they needed it, and build that into the pension system so that people had something decent to retire on, rather than going in exactly the opposite direction, where people now in the media rejoice every time a decent pension scheme bites the dust. It's a kind of crazy world of going nowhere and ending up with even greater dependence down the line. I'm part of the lucky post-war generation. We understood the importance and had the facility of the importance of earnings that allowed us to actually build for retirement. We had the best of the welfare state. We had the development of the National Health Service and free education. We are the lucky generation, and we are the generation that should now be arguing for a system that helps those who come behind us, not to look to others to bail them out, but to look to work together, so that at a time of need you knew you could draw down, and at a time of prosperity you can contribute in. It's pretty simple, really. The techniques for delivering it are not, and that's what I'd like us to debate tonight. Thank you very much.